Good afternoon, everyone. Some of you have, this is a kind of a rolling show all day today because we attach so much importance to this joint report. And I don't know if you physically have it, but if you don't, I'm sad for you. Here it is. It's called A Stronger Future, and that specifically describes what we who participated in this Sunnylands Wilson Center event believe about the U.S.-Mexico relationship. I think we're about to have a panel. Has everyone showed up? Everyone is here. So, and we're also going to, I think, show you a movie. Some of you have already seen the movie a couple of times, but it's good enough to see it even more. But I want to say several things. First of all, I came to the Wilson Center March 1 of last year, of 2011. On March 3, the current president of Mexico, Felipe Calderon, gave a major speech here, and it highlighted a couple of things. First of all, it was a very good speech with even better Q&A, and the fact that the president of Mexico would come here highlighted the importance, obviously, that he and his government attached to the Wilson Center. But it also means that in a more profound way that our center and Mexico and the United States are bound together. The Mexico Institute is the star performer at the Wilson Center. It was before Jane, during Jane, and I'm sure it will be after Jane. Andrew Seeley has been its director for many years and has been demoted to vice president of programs at the Wilson Center. But I do think all of you who know him and who know Eric and Chris should applaud them for enormous contribution. And I don't know that my job is to introduce others, but I can't restrain myself about saying something about two other people on this panel. One is mi hermano, right here, getting mic'd. He knows who he is. Arturo Sarachan, who, in all objectivity, is the best ambassador Mexico has ever sent to the United States. And we at the Wilson Center actually don't think he's the ambassador. We think he's our employee because he spends a lot of time here, involved in a very deep way in our programs and our conversations. And Arturo, I want to thank you for years of friendship going back to my long time in Congress, but for your enormous talent and passion about what this relationship can be. And the other person I want to mention, yes. Is Jeff Cowan, who is, I think, I can't see, but there, two over from Arturo, who is the president of the Annenberg Retreat at Sunnylands, was the past dean of the Annenberg Center at the University of Southern California, was the head of the Voice of America, is a noted author and playwright, an enormous talent, a dear friend of long standing. But he is the one who had the vision, I believe, in addition to the Annenberg family, of what Sunnylands could offer. And for those of us lucky enough, and several here were there, to be at the first retreat at Sunnylands, which was the retreat that generated the report about a stronger future. In fact, we actually have our little picture here. Here we were, the hardy souls who were lucky enough to be in paradise. For those of us who were there, we saw what this place can offer. And there are a lot of ideas that you will hear about shortly for carrying on the conversation at Sunnylands. One of the best of them, I will leak it immediately, is that we would very much like to have both presidents-elect, the president who wins our presidential election in November, and the president-elect of Mexico, who has already won his election, meet at Sunnylands in November before each of them is sworn in. We think that would be an enormous tribute, obviously, to the convening power of Sunnylands, but it also would be a huge statement about the importance of the relationship, and in all objectivity, of course, as a 9-term member of of Congress from California, about the importance of California to the relationship. Finally, we had a rollout on the Hill this morning where David Dreyer, chairman of the House Rules Committee, who has been so helpful to the Wilson Center and to the U.S.-Mexico relationship, and numbers of his colleagues spoke. One of them is a congressman from San Diego, California, named Bob Filner, who made the point that if California were a country, Mexico would be first on its agenda. And that's a very important comment. I think it applies to some other states in the country as well. And one of Filner's recommendations is that we should have stronger relationships with local officials. We do have strong relationships with local officials, and we have a very strong relationship with members of Congress in both parties. So it is my pleasure to welcome you all here and to, I guess, show you a movie. No?
Introduce Jeff.
Introduce Jeff first, who will talk to you, and then show you a movie. But Jeff Cowan is a major reason why this report exists, and he is a major reason why we will have the capability, combining forces, to take this report and its recommendations to the next level. And he is a major reason why I have a very lovely life filled with dear friends. Please welcome him.
Thank you, Jake.
I think I'm talking here, right?
Oh, you want to talk from there?
Yeah,
Sure.
I think I can talk here. But then we're going to have to stand up so people can see the films. Right. Thank you, Jane. Does anybody ever introduce you in this place to get people get to talk about you so that there's applause for Jane Harman? Let me just say,
grandmother.
yeah, actually there was a conversation before this little private meeting, and Jane and I are passing back pictures of our grandchildren. But we've known each other since way before that. But Jane, it's so terrific being partners with you. When we looked for a way to make Sunnylands, which I want to describe in a moment, to make it the kind of institution that the Annenbergs dreamed about, we thought, how would we find the ideal partner for the kind of retreat we want to hold? And you personally and your colleagues here at the Wilson Center have been dream partners for us. So could I please ask everybody to applaud Jane for all of her great work and for this exciting chapter in your life, and for your grandchildren. How many have you got?
All in 11, and a step-great-grandchild. Try that.
So imagine, and you know all their names. So that's a lot of work for somebody who's also running a great institution like this, and on how many boards? A lot of boards, including USC, I have to say here. Anyway, the Annenberg family, most of you will remember this. Walter and Leonore Annenberg owned an amazing estate in Rancho Mirage right near Palm Springs, California. Paradise, you just heard it called. Jane earlier today said it's got to be on everybody's bucket list to go there at least as a visitor. It's an amazing place. Its own golf course, 11 lakes. It's really quite spectacular. And many of you remember it because Ronald Reagan was there for 18 years for New Year's Eve, including all 8 when he was President of the United States. And the whole International Press Corps gathered outside those gates saying, what's happening behind the pink wall? Well, now that we're letting people behind the pink wall. They turned over this estate, this 200-acre magnificent estate, with a very generous endowment, to become for one thing, a place for people to visit that's amazing, but also to be a small retreat center, maybe 20, 22 people at a time at the maximum, to make a difference in the world, to really have important high-level retreats, starting with, for the President of the United States or the Secretary of State, to meet with world leaders to bring about international agreements. They thought of it as a Camp David of the West. And we hope it will become that. But as we were thinking about what topic could we first meet about, what could be more perfect than to talk about U.S.-Mexico relations because of our location, because of passions that the Annenbergs had about Mexico, because of when you come to visit it, so that it'll check that thing off your bucket list, you'll see there's a lot of Mexico actually in the center. In fact, if you look up here, you'll see the sun god logo. There's a major element of Mexico that's part of the Annenberg retreat at Sunnylands, and also because so much of the world focuses on the Atlantic, and now a lot of other countries in the world, but there's been much too little attention to, we think, Mexico, and truly the rest of Central and South America. So we hope that'll become a function of what we do. But secondly, we were so blessed to have Jane and Andrew suggest maybe we could partner on something on Mexico, because the work of the Mexico Institute, as she said, has been so terrific. So this partnership has been very, very special. And the meeting that took place there, and you'll hear quite a bit about it from other presenters, so I don't want to talk about it too much, except to say that the goal was that it be bipartisan, that it be binational, that it be safe, that it be open, that it be a place for real open discussion, and that what we do have an impact on the world, that something really would come out of it. But in introducing this film, I want to say that, to me, probably the single biggest aha, which was, oh, I knew that, but I didn't know that, was that as important as the issues we read about every day in the paper are about Mexico, they always seem to focus on problems, on drug problems, on violence, on illegal immigrant issues, and there's so much more. There's so much that is so exciting about Mexico and about Mexican-American relations, and how could we put that back at the center of the narrative? And I come from a school of communication from that field. How do we change the narrative, not to ignore problems, but to celebrate all the exciting opportunities? And as you'll see, there are so many exciting areas for us to work on together. One of the features of the Annenberg Retreat at Sunnylands is that we wanted, maybe partly because we're so close to Hollywood, but partly because one of our key people who helped to produce this thing, you'll see her name in a moment at the end of this film, is Cindy Kennard, who many of you know is a terrific reporter, producer, a former top executive of National Public Radio. We decided video has to be part of what we do. And so Cindy arranged for interviews with the people who were there, and she put together, I think, quite a nice film that will give you a flavor of what was discussed at this retreat. And I just want to, before introducing the film, say one more word, which is that it doesn't end here. As Jane said, this is a rollout. We were in Congress before. We're having this session. We're going to have meetings at both conventions, if any of you plan to be either at the Republican or Democratic convention. We hope you'll come to the briefings that we'll have there. And we'll be working with both presidential campaigns in this country as well as with the newly elected president of Mexico, so that these issues, we hope, become central to the dialogue that takes place between these countries. And as Arturo may say later, a couple of things have already happened. One, which I'll let him talk about later, but one which I'll mention, is that we think that business, jobs, energy, culture are all such strong themes. And John Engler, who you'll see in the tape in a moment, head of the Business Roundtable, was there. Daniel Servides, head of Grupo Bimbo, the largest bakery in the world, was there. And they decided that the business leaders of these countries had to start working together in a bigger way, and they've already taken on that initiative. So we think that things have already come out of this retreat, and we hope a lot more will. And with that, maybe we could step off the stage so that people can see the film.
Every 12 years, Mexican and U.S. presidential elections coincide. That means presidential terms starting out with new agendas and new goals. 2012 is one of those years. The Annenberg Retreat at Every 12 years, Mexican and U.S. presidential elections coincide. That means presidential terms starting out with new agendas and new goals. 2012 is one of those years. The Annenberg Retreat at Sunnylands and the Woodrow Wilson Center's Mexico Institute brought together 22 experts, leading politicians, strategists, and policymakers from both sides of the border. A strategy that emerged for the incoming presidents of the United States and Mexico a binational, and for the United States, a bipartisan strategy, envisioning the future of the U.S.-Mexico relationship.
Well, it matters because as a neighbor, it is a country that we are interlinked with in so many different ways. People, business, culture, history, and as such, it is one of the most vital relationships that we have anywhere in the world.
We share a common border, a common history. Some 36 million Americans trace their ancestry to Mexico.
The U.S.-Mexico relationship is vitally important because it's such an economically important relationship. It's a big trading partner, one of our very top trading partners in the entire world. Mexico, U.S., and Canada taken together form an economic region that's bigger than the entire EU.
The economic ties of the countries are very large and profound, and we can do much better than what we've been doing in the past.
It is also about how Mexico and the United States in a post-Cold War world rethink our footprint on the global stage. It is about how we rethink how we develop renewable and non-renewable energy sources to be able to continue to grow and to be able to create green jobs and to wean America from less reliable sources of oil elsewhere around the world. So the impact is multifaceted, and it has a direct impact on the daily lives of millions of Americans.
That's why the relationship is so important, and we neglect it. We forget about it. We concentrate on the Middle East, on Africa, on Asia, and we forget our own neighbor, and it makes no sense.
I hope it's vastly improved. For many here in the United States, Mexico is almost invisible, except if you're talking about immigration and the drug cartels. We should be looking in the next 12 years to building on a relationship of trust and friendship that understands that our economies are becoming more and more integrated.
I hope that 12 years from now it looks like the United States relationship with Canada. I hope that it basically looks like a relationship of countries that have similar standards of living, similar opportunities for the citizens of the country.
I see a secure, efficient border where trade continues to multiply, where those $1 billion a day of trade that go back and forth can be expanded upon, where people cross the border in a secure, orderly, safe manner, where the United States, Canada, and Mexico expand our ability to trade across the Pacific through the Trans-Pacific Partnership. This is what this relationship should look like.
If both countries cooperate and put things on the table and look for the low-hanging fruit opportunities, we can certainly have a big impact in the prosperity of those that are most in need.
One is probably the most significant issue that will impact the future prosperity of the United States and Mexico, which is getting labor mobility, and within labor mobility, immigration right.
In the area of trade, there are tremendous opportunities to overcome some of the national regulatory burdens and barriers that are there. It's as simple as how you get maybe trucks across borders or goods and people, because today companies are all global.
I think the other area that we could work much better at is leveraging the North American economic platform that comes with Canada, the United States, and Mexico.
As the U.S. economy is the most energy-intensive nation in the world, and Mexico has significant natural resource to help not only Mexico become a much more competitive nation, but also to go along with our partners in terms of being a reliable energy supplier to the American economy.
The second one, obviously, is how we jointly work to defang transnational organized crime operating on both sides of our border and in both our countries.
I hope our next administration, whether it's President Obama's second administration or Republican administration, will really look at this and try to step up our involvement on this side of the border.
The biggest challenge we have for the United States is to find a way for people to turn off the preconceived notion and just open their eyes and take a new look at what really is Mexico.
26 states in America today have Mexico as their first or second largest export market. And there are 6 to 8 million jobs in these states directly related to trade with Mexico. So how do we ensure that we can continue by trading, by growing together to enhance our well-being, job creation in the North American market, but also our market share of global trade?
I think that these two presidents could have a historic moment, and one that, if they handle right, could transform not only both countries, but more importantly, this trans-border relationship to heights that it's never achieved before.
One, I want the presidents to develop good personal ties. That's so important. Number two, I want them to meet frequently. This is why I like the idea of Sunnylands, and this is why I like the idea of the Woodrow Wilson Center being a venue for a better relationship between the leaders of both countries.
If history is a guide, the presidents-elect will meet one another before meeting with any other heads of state. And in this special 12-year cycle, it's a fresh opportunity for new strength and vitality in the U.S.-Mexico partnership.
Let's turn it over to Ambassador Arturo Sarucán, who's going to offer special remarks. You want to go in straight into the panel?
Why don't we straight into the panel?
Go straight into the panel?
Yeah, I'm not going to say much more than what's already there. So.
Okay, well, in that case, let's go straight into the panel discussion. We'll talk a little bit about the findings. Before that, we'll talk a little bit about where the relationship is. Let me introduce the panel. You've already met Jane Harman, who I think all of you know, President, CEO, and Director of the Wilson Center, in some order there. As well as grandmother and great step-grandmother. Jeff Cowan, you know, from the president of Sunnylands, the Annenberg Retreat at Sunnylands. Ambassador Arturo Sarucán, I think everyone in this audience knows. A fantastic ambassador of Mexico and really outstanding representative of the government of Mexico in this country. Rafael Fernández de Castro, author of the leading book on U.S.-Mexico relations, in contemporary times, professor and director of international relations at ITAM University, former foreign policy advisor in the Calderon administration as well. And as well, as is Ambassador Sarucán, a member of the advisory board of the Mexico Institute. And let me acknowledge also John Feely, who's the PDAS, as they say, the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for Western Hemisphere, as well as former Chargé d'Affaires of the U.S. Embassy in Mexico. So very glad to have you here. Let's start off with a discussion. At some point, we'll throw him a curveball and see what he thinks about all this as well. And David Shirk, good to see you, the director of the Transborder Institute and a key partner of ours, actually, working on a number of issues, particularly security. So, David, good to have you here. Let's start off with a temperature read on the relationship. Before we start talking about proposals for the future, we will get into the proposals that come out of this retreat. But where is the U.S.-Mexico relationship today? Better, worse, from 10 years ago to now? Unrecognizable? What would you say, Ambassador?
I think there's a sea change that has occurred in this bilateral relationship. Mm-hmm. What I'm about to say, does not mean that there are persisting challenges and issues that need to be dealt with in the bilateral relationship. There are outstanding problems and there are outstanding challenges on both sides of the border. But I don't think that the relationship had ever achieved the strategic direction and the muscle tone that this relationship has today. It's moved from being a transactional relationship to a truly strategic relationship with a global outlook. And this was unheard of in this bilateral relationship 10 years ago. And despite the urban myth that seems to be percolating out these days in certain corners of both our countries, that the relationship is only centered or is only about counter-narcotics cooperation and security, this is gobbledygook. This is absolutely false. This relationship, yes, has had security cooperation at the center of the bilateral relationship for very obvious and painful reasons on both sides of the border. We need to confront one of the most pervasive
post-Cold War dynamics, which is the emergence of non-state actors in the shape of very violent transnational organized crime, whether it's money laundering or drugs or human trafficking, which affect both our nations and the security and the well-being and the prosperity of citizens on both sides of the border. But this in no way or in no measure means that these past 5.5 years we've just been talking about these issues. Look at how we've resolved some of the most pressing trade dispute issues that had been festering in this bilateral relationship for decades. We've solved trucks, we're solving tuna, we're solving label of origin, we're solving potato, which is an issue which was important for American producers and members of Congress. We have been cutting through Gordian knots of trade disputes that have been festering for decades. We have inaugurated, for the first time in a decade, 3 new ports of entry across our common border. The first time in 10 years that we've inaugurated new border infrastructure. And if this $1 billion a day of trade that go back and forth between Mexico and the United States is to continue to provide economic well-being and job creations, if this now $1 trillion of North American trade that we have now reached, it's a new threshold of North American trade. If this is going to continue, we'd better darn make sure that we've got the 21st century border infrastructure that can take into account these flows and ensure that our trade is both secure but also agile. And so the 21st Century Border Declaration that both administrations launched 2 years ago, is the first time in the history of the bilateral relationship that there has been a holistic vision for border management in the White House and in Pinos. It had never happened before. Energy. 2 years ago, the moratorium on one of the gaps, one of the transboundary reservoirs in the Gulf of Mexico, the Western Gap, ran out in 2012. What this meant was that for 10 years, Mexico and the United States had agreed not to do exploration or exploitation of resources in these common reservoirs of oil in our respective territorial waters in the Gulf of Mexico. And so the discussion was, and John, you'll remember this, let's negotiate an extension of the moratorium for another 10 years. And some of us said, guys, we've got an opportunity here. Why instead of negotiating another 10-year moratorium, we sit down and we finally get our act together and negotiate how we would eventually jointly exploit common reservoirs in the Gulf of Mexico. People on both sides of the border said we were crazy. We were never going to get the Mexican Senate to support us. We weren't going to be able to finish the negotiation. We not only finished the negotiation in record time, in less than a year, but the Mexican Senate has approved the agreement. This is critically important, and it's a fundamental piece of the energy puzzle for North America. Not only about efficiency, security, but about independence. How we have turned the template and understanding that there needs to be a paradigm of joint responsibility on a host of issues in the bilateral relationship. I'm an internationalist. I was trained in international relations, so this is a very important issue for me. But something that would have not happened 10 years ago, 7 years ago, which is that as a result of this dialogue on security, we have broadened our template, and we're not only talking about security on our common border. These mechanisms for the expedited exchange of intelligence and information are being applied by both countries to other global and regional issues which had never been part of the Mexico-U.S. bilateral agenda. Yes, we had tussled over Central America in the 70s, but global and regional issues had never been a formal part of our agenda. They're now the backbone, and they're one of the most important components of our bilateral dialogue. So, Andrew, I think a lot has changed. And for those who suggest that this relationship is centered on narcotics and drugs and thugs, they should really look at what has been achieved these past 5.5 years.
Jay, why is there a disjuncture? You've had the chance to see the relationship both from the U.S. Congress as a senior member and at the Wilson Center. Why is there this disjuncture between the sense in the United States that it's a tough relationship and there's all this difficulty and we are not close neighbors, and yet the deep interaction that actually goes on?
I think certainly most people in Congress, and I would guess a vast majority of the American public, are way underinformed about the good side of the relationship. the headlines in newspapers are always about the beheaded people and some of the ugly crime-related incidents in Mexico, and that's about it. The election was reported, but I don't see much else. I mean, that's, by the way, in all objectivity, one of the great values of the Wilson Center, because we provide reports and information about what the real relationship is and about this cross-border trade where manufacturing happens on both sides of the border. It's not finished goods going to Mexico. It's goods being finished with Mexico on both sides of the border and economic prosperity for both sides. So nobody knows that story except for those who read the brilliant Wilson products and know this man. The rest of you are sitting in this room. Everyone else doesn't know the story, which is a tragedy. But there are also a couple of urban myths that are worth putting out there. One is, certainly Congress, many in Congress buy this, that we are overrun with illegal immigration from Mexico, and those people are taking all the American jobs. Some would argue there aren't any American jobs, but nonetheless, if there were any, those people would take them. Well, hello. Illegal immigration from Mexico to the U.S. is virtually zero. Did you know? Sure, the economy has had something to do with that, but so has effective border enforcement.
And the Mexican economy.
And the booming Mexican economy. So there is virtually no illegal immigration. I think there's still urgency to deal with the immigration issue in this country, but nonetheless, that boogeyman is not there. Second, everyone is decrying the fact that there seems to be no way out of our energy problem, and we're going to endlessly be dependent on Middle Eastern oil. I would point out that there is a huge amount of instability in the Middle East, and we have done business with some folks over decades that, looking back on it, might not have been our wisest choices. But as Ambassador Sarikhan just told you, there is a huge opportunity in energy collaboration, not just in fossil fuels, but certainly in natural gas and in renewables, huge opportunity to forge a regional energy platform, Mexico, U.S., and Canada, that could make our region not just self-sufficient, but a net exporter of energy to other parts of the world. People don't know that either, so that's a second urban myth. In conclusion, I think that the title of this report, which was a stronger, let me see, forgot
Stronger
already.
Future.
A Stronger Future, thank you, Jeff. Stronger Future. That was a good collaboration right there. Is the right? It's the right name for the report, but with respect, at least to my last employer, the United States Congress, a future is what should be communicated to Congress. The fact that there is a positive future, and that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts if we do this relationship right. And because we will have new presidents, either a re-elected president or a brand new president in this country and a new president in Mexico, November would not be too early to start that new relationship.
Great. Let me recognize Tim Daly, by the way, from Western Union, who's one of our board members as well. Glad to have you here. Jeff, why did you decide, why did Sunnylands think of Mexico as, as you started, Sunnylands has long hosted retreats, but as it becomes an official retreat center in the bequest of the Annenberg family, why Mexico as a starting retreat? Why does this relationship matter?
For one thing, we went through a process, which Cindy actually also led, with our board of deciding what could be unique about this particular place. As you know, it's a spectacular and unique setting for meetings, but what could be distinctive that's different from Bellagio or from Aspen, if you think of it as a retreat center, or from Peconico or the Y Plantation? What's our unique sweet spot? And we felt that it was the Trans-Pacific area. And that certainly includes China, but China gets a tremendous amount of attention. It includes, for example, Korea. It would include all of Asia and East Asia especially. But it should include Mexico and Central and South America. And all of our trustees agreed on this. Because of our location, the Coachella Valley, where we're located, you all think of it probably as a rich area. Well, it's rich, but the people who take care of the people who are rich are not as rich. It's, I think, something like 70 or 80% Hispanic, the area where we are. We are very close to Mexico, and there was the Mexican tradition that the Annenbergs had. So, and besides that, several of us who were involved at the leadership area of the retreat felt that this was a tremendously important area. But so we had it on our list of things to do, maybe the short list of maybe half a dozen topics we're excited about. But frankly, Andrew, what drove it across the border for us was the meeting we had right here with you and Jane when you guys said this is an area we would love to partner in. Because we need to have strong partners, and I make this an invitation to others in the room. We can only do a certain number of retreats a year, but where we have a great partner on a high-level subject where they bring in the expertise and the relationships that you do in this area, it makes it really a terrific place for a retreat. So I would say that it's our location, it's the interest of the trustees, it's the history of the place, but truly it was having great partners in this area.
Well, thank you. Raphael, let me ask you, I mean, one of the things that strikes me has changed in this relationship over the past 10 years, and you've written about this a lot, is not only what goes on in the bilateral relation itself, the issues that are on the bilateral agenda, but how the two countries deal with each other vis-a-vis the rest of the world. There's been an opening of discussions on broader issues that go beyond migration, security, trade, which are the basic issues that have been on the bilateral agenda if you go back 30 years or 40 years, and certainly are intensified today. What can you tell us about what's changed in the way we talk with each other about these larger global issues? And you've been close to this in work you've done.
Before I answer you this difficult question, Andrew, let me thank Jeff for inviting me to Sunnylands. Let me share with all of you, I mean, for example, the last dinner at Sunnylands at the retreat. It was, I believe, a Saturday night, and we have a lovely dinner. And actually, I mean, few of the participants, they have already gone, but the ones who stayed, like me, we really had a beautiful time because Jeff invited a group of Mexican artists, Kate del Castillo, La Reina del Sur, who, I mean, she's one of my favorite actresses. and she was telling us really, I mean, how difficult it has been for her to become a star in Hollywood. It hasn't been easy for her. And it was a very nice program. There was also a clothes designer and also a film director, and we really had a beautiful time. So, I mean, I just wanted to give you a sense that not only we engage in serious conversation, but also we have this lovely time and very alive time at dinner. And thank you, Jeff. And Sunnylands is very special for this. We're in California, and why not to bring some Hollywood people among us? Okay. Andrew, seems to me that on foreign policy and global affairs is in one of those areas in which still we could have a lot of improvement in U.S.-Mexican relations. The dialogue between Mexico and the U.S. is still not where it could be. In the report, we're saying that Mexico is punching below its weight, and it's right. But also, and this is something that I've been seeing, I would say a lot of Mexican diplomats, of course, not Arturo Sarucán, not anyone here in this room. There's quite a few Mexican diplomats here. But I would say there's still a legacy about not cooperating with the U.S. in foreign affairs. It is still difficult for some diplomats to do that, and that's part of the legacy, and we must stop doing that. Seems to me that there's at least 3 urgent areas in which we should put our act together. First of all is Central America. I mean, Honduras has become the country in the world with the highest homicide rate. I mean, and why? Well, Mexico is not only Mexico is not helping, but I will say Mexico is exporting setas to Central America, and we're creating a lot of problems to Central America. El Salvador and Guatemala, now they have more casualties than during the war years of the 70s and 80s because of organized crime and because of violence and because of juvenile gangs. So, I mean, this is the time for the U.S., Canada, Colombia, to put our act together and to do something urgently in Central America. Seems to me that the new phase of the Merida Initiative has to have a Central American component. It's not that easy. It's going to be very difficult. I mean, to deal with these tiny countries that sometimes they used to get a lot of foreign aid. It's difficult, it will not be easy, but we must do it. Second, I will say, in the hemisphere, there's a lot of things for us to do together. I mean, let's face it, the Organization of American States is very weak now, the OEAS. We should try to do something there. Mexico was, one of the great, architects of the new CELAC, the new organization of Latin America without the US and Canada. But let's face it, now it is really Hugo Chavez from Venezuela. It's really the Hugo Chavez and its friends who have really tried to make of CELAC a body that it's in a way anti-American. And seems to me that is not in the convenience of Mexico, that is not in Mexico's interest. And seems to me that on that, for example, in trying to prevent the interventionist populism of Hugo Chavez, we should ally with the U.S. with no problem. And of course, when we're not in agreement with the U.S., there's a maturity in the relationship to say, on this, we're going to take different paths. Finally, it seems to me there's a very good lesson in 2009 and 2010. Mexico had a seat in the UN Security Council. And we did very good things together. In 2010, I'll tell you, Mexico was perhaps one of the key allies of the group of six that were dealing with Iran in trying to stop the enrichment of uranium. We had a lot of problems with Brazil and with Turkey, and believe me, Mexico was very much a partner with the US and with Germany. President Calderon kept on talking with Angela Merkel, with President Obama about this. And this was silent, this was beyond the radar of the media, and we did very well. So it seems to me that Mexico will gain a lot, and the U.S. out of cooperating in global affairs, but we're still not there yet, and we have to change things in Mexico as well as in the U.S. to do that.
Let's go and do one more round, and let's talk about the future, actually, the future together. I think this is a stronger future. How do we get there? And let me go to Arturo and Jane first. Talk about the economic relationship. How do we get economics back on the agenda here? It's been there. It has its own inertia. But how do we bring it front and center in policy terms in the relationship?
I would respond it's already there, and it's the 800-pound gorilla in the room. I've for anyone who's been here and heard me speak in this auditorium or in other auditoriums, you know that I throw out the data that I think is very compelling about the impact of this two-way trade and economic relationship. But, Mexico is the second largest buyer of U.S. exports, and regardless of where your geographic areas of expertise are, we buy more U.S. exports than all of Latin America and the Caribbean together. We buy more U.S. exports than Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, and the U.K. combined. We buy more U.S. exports than China and Japan put together, or given that they're now in vogue, we buy more U.S. exports than the 4 BRIC countries put together. This is a stunning two-way trade relationship. The impact that this has on the well-being, on the jobs, on job creation, is one of the reasons that compelled Mexico to decide to seek Trans-Pacific Partnership accession for several reasons. Number one, because it will continue to deepen these trends, which you have highlighted so well in the report that was put out by Chris. We don't have one here, but we should also be parading that one around.
Oh, the other part.
TPP is, first of all, a mechanism to ensure that we continue to create jobs in North America via trade, that we expand the North American market share of global trade, which has been declining in the past 10 years, and we need to enhance our ability to compete. And accessing Asia-Pacific markets through the TPP is a wonderful way of doing this. It's about deepening the supply and production chains in North America that have been absolutely integrated, and which explain, among other things, why Detroit came back from the brink in 2009. And why the automotive industry in the United States is where it is today, because of this connectivity in the North American market. Second, it's about upgrading NAFTA through the back door. It's preventing us from renegotiating NAFTA. Why? Because NAFTA is a 1.0 free trade agreement. It was negotiated almost now 20 years ago. And a lot has happened in global trade and in the practices of trade diplomacy that
is not encompassed in NAFTA. And in many ways, TPP would allow us, without renegotiating TPP, by Canada and Mexico incorporating themselves into the TPP components on IPR, on labor, or environment, of upgrading NAFTA without having to go through a trilateral negotiation that would obviously break NAFTA apart. But third, it's also about rethinking geopolitics and geoeconomics in the hemisphere. It's about binding the like-minded countries of the hemisphere, if you like my tongue-in-cheek coalition of the free trade willing, of the countries that have free trade agreements amongst ourselves in the hemisphere, that happen to be on the Pacific, and that through TPP partnership can start providing alternative designs to how we interact in the Americas. And if you think of Canada, the US, Mexico, Colombia, Peru, Chile, with the potential accession of Panama and Costa Rica, which we all have free trade agreements amongst ourselves. Some of those nations, some of us are APEC members, some of us are now negotiating the TPP agreements. This completely changed the way that we should be thinking of trade, of prosperity, but also about statecraft in the Americas. So that's why I think in the run-up to TPP, and this is the other area that I was going to parade around the place, because if you look at the report was, we had this meeting March. We were still lobbying to ensure that Mexico got into the TPP negotiations, and therefore one of the recommendations in the report is ensure that the United States welcomes Mexico into the TPP negotiations as quickly as possible. Well, yesterday or the day before, the administration, USTR, has now officially sent the letter to Congress, giving them the 90-day period of initiation of negotiations with Mexico for the TPP. So in many ways, the report has already proven to be extremely prescient and has already a profound impact in the sense that one or even two of its recommendations are already being implemented. But I think TPP is the great next geostrategic design for the bilateral relationship.
Great, thank you.
Well, building on that, with which I agree, I think changing the language used in the political conversation will be very helpful. Those of us who were old enough to remember NAFTA, I was 5 at the time, but I had just been elected to Congress, remember it as a... yes, and if you believe that, I have some other things to tell you. Remember it as a very divisive time, and interest groups on both sides were dug in. It was unusual that a Democratic president was pushing it, but there was lots of resistance in both political parties. I remember very well. At any rate, I think Arturo is right. Let's not talk about NAFTA anymore. Let's not even talk about bilateral trade agreements. Let's talk about something else that has a global, that globally recasts what the U.S. and Mexico and Canada might be capable of doing together. I mentioned it in the energy context, but it applies all over the place. I was recently at the Canadian Embassy, by the way, and saw their computer program, which identifies U.S. congressional districts and shows how many jobs in each district are related to U.S.-Canada trade. I assume Mexico has one too. Too few members of Congress have gotten the visit, or if they've gotten the visit, it hasn't penetrated. It's not just border states that need the visit. It's the central part of our country who need to understand that these trading relationships are crucially important. And again, the economic story is underreported or unreported. As people start to get what it could be, and as the new presidents hopefully use their bully pulpits, or better yet, one converged bully pulpit at Sunnylands or some lesser important place to announce this, I think the conversation will change. And I think it is absolutely critical, both in economic terms but in security terms, that the conversation change.
Andrew, could I ask you to just describe one fact that was in the research that you have prepared on this stuff that I think is something people don't realize, which is the difference between the amount of American labor that goes into a product that we import from Mexico versus a product that we import, let's say, from China?
I think it's fascinating. Chris Wilson, who really is the driving force behind this, also has written a publication called Working Together, I think is out there, where he finds, and I'll speak for Chris, but one of the things he finds is that about 40% of the content on Mexican exports to the United States are U.S. made. And we think it's about the same way the other direction. We just don't have the numbers yet, but we think it's very similar. Now, what does this tell us? Well, what does that mean? And from China, it's about 3%. Canada's 25%. Canada's very similar. It's a little lower, but it's very similar. China's about 3%. Every other place in the world is somewhere between sort of 0 to 5. Canada and Mexico, of major countries in the world, are the only ones that stand out. What does this tell us? What it tells us is that we don't just export goods to each other. These are goods that are actually manufactured on both sides of the border. We actually are doing joint production processes. And so when we think of a car, and automobiles and automobile parts are a big part of this, but they're not the only part, as it turns out. When we think of products that are made in Mexico or made in the United States, they almost always have some parts that are made on the other side of the border, or at least much of the time, 40% of the time, have some parts made in the other country. I mean, this is actually quite impressive. It tells you the depth of integration. And when you're thinking about international trade relationships, what we do vis-a-vis the rest of the world, whether it's in the WTO or TPP or anything else, meaning to think together, it may be a very productive way to go, actually. So I want to finish up with Jeff in a moment, actually. We're going to talk about society-to-society relations. So before we get to that, let me ask you, Rafael, about two things that you've written a lot about. One is about educational exchange. What can we do in educational exchange together? And about migration. Is there an opportunity right now in migration, given that numbers are so low?
Let me give you three responses for two. On how to prepare for the future, seems to me that we have to go to the basement of the relationship and work and do a little bit of plumbing. Seems to me that we need, for example, there are some mechanisms like the interparliamentary meeting that is put in the report, or the border governors conference, that they kind of weak now, and we have to strengthen in those institutions, those mechanisms. Seems to me that I mean, there's a very good dialogue at the heads of the government, but we still need these mechanisms to make sure that we're ready to confront a difficult future, because it's always difficult, always complex. And also we have to further engage people like business persons, like university presidents, and because this is not only about the federal government, but we really have to be very open to other groups, because this is a very complex and a very intense relationship. On migration, seems to me that yes, the opportunity is out there, because as Jane just said, there's zero migration now from Mexico here. But unfortunately, I mean, that
zero net.
Illegal.
Zero net migration.
Net illegal
There's about 140,000 Mexicans coming every year, and coming back around 160,000. I mean, there's, if not negative, there's zero migration, but it's very close.
Although Mexico is still the biggest source country for legal immigration in the United States, still about a quarter of all legal immigration.
And now there's a lot of, and that's why we have to work on the visa system. That will be very important. But still, we have to face that there's a lot of suffering in the migrant community out there. In the last 3 years, there's been 800,000 Mexicans being deported from inside the U.S. That's a lot of suffering, because at least 1 out of 2 Mexicans deported to Mexico, they live in a family here. So the suffering is very bad. So we must do something. And on that, seems to me that we have to be tougher with the Obama administration. We know they say they're aiming well, but they haven't done well with the migrant community. We have to get tougher. And let's face it, there's a lot of suffering there as I never seen in the last 2 or 3 decades. So we still have something there to work it out. In terms of student mobility, I mean, this is very sad. Mexico is now the number 8, the number 9 country in sending Mexican students to U.S. universities. China is number 1, with 160,000 students every year coming here. India is number 2. South Korea is number 3, with more than 70,000 students. And Mexico, in the last 10 years, has been sending between 12,000 and 14,000 students to the U.S.
And the country right above Mexico is Vietnam, by the way.
Yeah, and so...
I mean, who would have thought, right? I mean, this is
you're absolutely
sending
right.
more students to the United States to study than Mexico next door.
Then, and to get things more complicated, and this is very sad, this year Costa Rica will receive more American students than Mexico. Tiny Costa Rica. Mexico is number 9 in receiving American students because of security reasons. Now there's some improvements out there. Finally, the State Department, and thanks for this, is issuing these tourist alerts by state. It's not talking about the entire country, but they're doing it state by state. That is helping us because, yes, indeed, there's problems in Chihuahua, there's problems in Tamaulipas, there's problems in Guerrero, but not in the entire Mexican Republic. So that is helpful. But it seems to me that this is the time, Andrew, in which we really have to be very ambitious and to look into the future. And if Mexico is the 3rd largest U.S. trade partner, seems to me that the vision should be that Mexico should be the 3rd country in sending more students to the U.S. and the other way around. President Obama just launched in Cartagena a very important initiative. They call it 100,000 Strong, and this is about to have 100,000 U.S. students in Latin America and about to have 100,000 Latin American students in the U.S. Well, Mexico should be the number 1 country there, and seems to me that this is a key area because, let's face it, if we want to get prepared for the future, we have to have more Mexicans coming here to study, to take advantage of the best university system in the world, and have more Americans to come to Mexico to get prepared, to get educated. And I guess a key component of this exchange should be the Mexican-American community here. It's very sad what is happening. I kept on listening. Once in a meeting I was told that Asians are preparing their children in this country to become the next CEOs of the multinational firms. Mexicans and Latinos are preparing their children to continue to do as they are because they the ones performing the worst in education in this country. We have to change that, and there's a lot of ideas in the report, and seems to me that this should be a priority looking into the future.
Can I just say that Rafael's doing his share because he's got a son at USC, so we appreciate that.
Well, Jeff, you know, in Washington we tend to think everything is government-to-government relations. You spend a fair share of your time in the city, but the reality is relationships between countries are driven as much, and especially countries as deeply integrated as Mexico and the United States, are driven by relationships between a broader cross-section of people in the two countries, state and local governments, organizations, the business community. How do we build this kind of dialogue between Mexico and the United States?
Well, of course, we've offered Sunnylands as a place where some of those kind of meetings can take place as well. Culture is one of the areas that we talked about. And Rafael was nice enough to mention that we had a wonderful representation of Mexican-American culture in this country. The popularity of the Spanish media is huge. I mean, the success of the telenovelas here, or of music that is both cross-border and that is Mexican music. But the same is true in Mexico of the United States music. In fact, I don't know if the Wilson Center has ever done a study, or whether you have, Arturo, of how the cultural pairings between these countries compare with cultural pairings of other countries. It'd be interesting to know, because it may be higher than other countries.
Most of it is going to be informal.
No, that's but he's talking about informal.
Yeah.
But in fact,
sort of what I mean is, I truly think that in cultural terms, this is. I always say that these two countries are the most important two countries on the face of the earth, one for the other.
Right.
But in cultural terms, how culture is being reinvented by truly trans-border communities. You see it in Tijuana, San Diego.
Right.
This is a very dynamic exchange going back and forth. This is one of the reasons why we have spent, at least here in the embassy, so much time using cultural promotion as a public diplomacy soft power tool. I do think, I've said this and I'll continue to say it, Mexico is a global cultural superpower on the face of the earth. And these connections between our two countries, whether it's formal film industry ties or whether it's what young hipsters on both sides of the border and how they're reinventing music in Tijuana, San Diego, but a lot of that, thank God, is occurring outside the domain of government intervention.
If I could just add a couple things, again, coming from California, which I joke is called North Mexico. The Mexican architecture, Mexican landscape, Mexican food, Mexican holidays. Cinco de Mayo maybe is a California holiday, I don't know. But it is everywhere. Mexican language. Los Angeles is a majority-minority city, and most of the majority, which is Hispanic, is Mexican, Mexican-American. And so it is, parts of our country get this. One of the things we are going to do at the Wilson Center is hold a national conversation on culture as a foreign policy tool. Not just for this relationship, but across the world. And it's so interesting in parts of the world that say they hate us when they're polled, hate the U.S. Then you look at what are they watching on television, and did you know that a form of American Idol is a hot TV program in the Middle East? Who would imagine? And so, I mean, these are things we underestimate, and I'm not promoting American Idol in particular, personally. But
Though Jane will be appearing on that soon.
Yes, I will be. Yes. No, Dancing with the Stars. Dancing with the Stars is much closer to my love. But I think that we underestimate how much more we could do with exchanges of certainly, the movie people in the movies and singers and so forth, but art. Is a huge cultural tool.
And this is why, if I can just very quickly interrupt, I'm so glad and happy that one of the issues that I've been banging my drum on for several years, because it feeds into this, which was adopted as a recommendation here, is having Mexico and the United States co-host a joint bid of the World Cup in 2026. Yes. Not only because of the societal...
Arturo will play in it.
I will not. I could succeed the current FIFA general director or manager. That would be interesting. Imagine the impact.
It's larger than the UN.
Imagine the impact of having 10 U.S. cities, 10 Mexican cities as host cities, the connectivity that would generate, the sense of co-stakeholdership between our two societies, and more importantly, the message that sends to the rest of the world about the U.S.-Mexico relationship by having that joint World Cup bid. So we'll see.
I think these informal or non-governmental connections, the World Cup proposal here, I think, is a very exciting one. The cultural thing, I think it tends to be the case that most Americans don't notice the radio stations that are in Spanish, so they pass them by. That is, English-speaking Americans don't notice. But in fact, in many cities, the number 1, 2, 3, maybe all stations are Mexican language stations. People who don't watch Telemundo or Univision don't recognize the importance of not only of both their entertainment and their news shows, but in many markets, including Los Angeles, often the number one news show is the Spanish language news show. But the Anglo community tends not to know it. We have to change the narrative so that people really understand the incredibly robust nature of this. And it's not just the government at all. It's stuff that's happening that people are doing. It was very exciting having, I thought, Grupo Bimbo there. I had not realized that they had become the largest bakery in the world. But where were they 10 years ago? They built in large part on the market that they were able to build on in this country to now the point that they own Sara Lee. It's an incredible story and something that I think we can really build on as a society without necessarily going through the government.
Great. I think that's a great way to actually open it up to end the formal discussion, open it up for questions, answers, comments. The actual proposals, Chris has made it very easy for you actually in Cindy, which is all the main proposals are on page 1, so you can find them very easily, run through them. But let's open up for questions and comments, and the first question is from the gentleman who hasn't raised his hand down here, John Feely, but since I know he's shy and retiring, let me put you on the spot, John.
Sure. I don't know as I need a microphone. I have one. Thank you, Andrew, and congratulations, everybody. Log rolling aside, this sounds like it was a phenomenal event, and it produced a terrific report. I was telling Cindy that I felt a little bit frustrated because as you went through and interviewed everybody at the beginning, you were stealing my talking points from the last 3 years in Mexico about why Mexico matters and why we need to pay more attention to it. I guess the question that I have, I'd like to pick up on where you guys were talking on culture. And Arturo said something that I think was very important, and you've been a tremendous patron of culture here with the Cultural Center up on 16th Street. But when we look at that culture, was there discussion at the retreat at focusing on Anglos in the United States and at making them or presenting to them something that seems a little less foreign. Because I always used to use, when I was in Mexico, my parents as a great litmus test. My parents are both college educated. My parents know nothing about Latin America and always have looked at me as a Latin Americanist as kind of a strange guy who went off kind of like a Dr. Livingston. And only through, no, and I would bring home music and things like that. And, you know, a couple of breakout artists. And it speaks directly to the question of English language. One of the things we're trying to do all throughout Latin America is to promote the study of English. Rafael, you mentioned that the President's 100,000 Strong initiative, 100,000 Strong in the Americas, the single greatest impediment to getting more Latin Americans to study in the United States is the English language. They can't pass the TOEFL exams. So we're trying to do things on that. But reverse, for those Latin Americans, those Mexicans in particular, who are here in the United States, in whatever capacity they may be in regarding their status, how does government and do non-governmental organizations have a role in promoting bilingualism effectively, so that the language, the art, the Nortec music is not quite as alien to folks like my parents?
I'll just mention two things that were discussed there. One of the participants was Michael Govan, who is the head of the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, of LACMA. And he has had a number of exhibits there that are basically cross-border or exhibits with Mexican art. And, you know, sometimes we undervalue the impact of museums, which are hugely important in terms of people going there. And of course, obviously, we think of the museum in Mexico City and how hugely important that is. But so I think that that's one place we began to talk about it. And the other thing was that this wonderful conversation we had with these Mexican artists was moderated by a man named Josh Kuhn, whose field of study is cross-border entertainment, which is a hugely important area. So we touched on it. But if we're thinking about things to follow up on, as far as Sunnylands is concerned, it's one of those areas I'd love to see us pursue.
Mm-hmm. So it's a fertile ground. And at the border, there's some interesting things happening. We were fortunately part of giving a prize for cross-border cooperation to the El Paso Art Museum and the Juarez Art Museum, have an incredibly fertile collaboration going on, in which people are both learning each other's techniques, but also contributing culturally across the border. And this happens naturally at the border. It has to happen a little bit more intentionally as you move back from that border. That's great. Others, I see a hand up there, and then a hand over here. We'll take two questions or comments here.
I'm Dr. Sam Hancock of Emerald Planet, Emerald Planet
here,
TV. Wonderful job today. This is to Jane and the ambassador. Looking at the energy cooperation on here, there was a great emphasis on the fossil fuels aspects of this, or the fossil sources of fuel, but there's one sentence that talks about wind and solar, and there's a tremendous opportunity for green jobs creation, and it goes beyond into hydrogen and low-flow hydro and all these other areas that have real potential. And with the research institutes in Monterey, Mexico City, and other places, and what's going on around the United States, there's a lot of cooperation that could occur of joint research between the universities, the research institutes, and also the creation of more renewables to, cut our dependency on fossil, which is not an affront to Mexico, but actually expands the opportunities for Mexican jobs and manufacturing.
Well,
so I'd just like you to comment on that, please.
This point was raised earlier today, and two words that were missing is who's still here?
Joe Dukert actually raised that point earlier. Yep.
Yes, are sustainability and environment. And they're words that we all know about and that could have been in this report. And if it goes through new iterations, as it will, because there'll be a meeting next year, they will be in the report. But I think that this is a short report. It's focused. It is focused on the future, but it's focused on some near-term goals too. And one of the energy recommendations is that Mexico open up its energy industry, and at least in the short term, that has a focus on some of the fossil fuel resources that it has. But you are right. There are green jobs in this country, in Mexico, and on a shared basis. And certainly coming from a city that used to be extremely polluted, I get it. They're the ones, in my personal list, on my personal list, that I would favor. But I don't want to. I think if we are talking about a trading bloc in energy, we still have to include opening up Mexico's energy market, including reference to fossil fuels and gas.
I would concur. I not only do I believe that for us to be able to see the recommendation of a common North American energy security, efficiency, and independence policy come true, Mexico is going to have to do some heavy lifting in and of its own in terms of revisiting that first series of reforms that President Calderon put to Congress and which were approved, and hopefully that will be one of the first deliverables I hope that we see in the next administration, because it really opens this up. But beyond that, I think certainly renewables and green jobs is a huge area of opportunity. It's not a coincidence that we have some of the most aggressive investments in the hemisphere, in especially wind and solar, occurring already in Mexico. The challenge there will be how we connect it to the grid and how we create regional hubs and regional grids on both sides of the border, which may not it may be a Southern California, Northern Baja California grid, or a Texas Tamaulipas or Texas Nuevo León grid. And that's the thinking that needs to start taking place. It's not only about generation capability, it's about then how do you bring that to the market and how you connect the grids. But I think that is one of the most promising areas throughout North America, Canada, Mexico, and the United States.
If I may say something on energy, it seems to me that the incoming Peña Nieto administration, I mean, they want to, I mean, and on this I see an echo of the Salinas administration. Salinas did very well the first year of its administration in renegotiating the Mexican foreign debt. And because of that, we were able to negotiate NAFTA. Now, the PRI, what they're thinking is to try to do energy reform very soon into the administration. So then that could be a game changer. And then having Mexico, I mean, seen once again as a more attractive place for foreign investment. So it's still fossil, but there's a lot of things going on there. And the partnership between Mexico and the U.S., for example, in the climate change issues, is a must. We continue to see there in different parts of the table. We have to come to some agreements there.
I would just add, by the way, we have a report that Duncan Wood authored and chaired looking at cooperation renewables. It's up on the web, and we can get you copies. But for any interest in that, he actually looks in great depth with some of his colleagues at the specific possibilities in different areas. But you're right, Sam, it's something that needs to be in the report in the future. Yep. There was a gentleman down here, and I think that may be our last question or comment, actually. We're getting near the witching hour here.
Well, first of all, thank you, distinguished panel. This has been fascinating to hear you. My name is Jorge Sobron. I'm a Mexican student, a grad student in the University of Kansas.
Thank you.
Yeah, really.
Thank you. If I remember well, there is roughly about over 1 million Americans residing in Mexico. More or less a year ago as well, I was reading an article by Andres Oppenheimer. He was highlighting the importance of this initiative that Presidente Calderon and President Obama were discussing about allowing Americans to have Medicare in Mexico. He was saying that it will not only create more jobs, will inject capital, but also will increase the numbers of Americans residing in Mexico as part of this integration. Do you find this plausible? And if so, could you elaborate a bit more in the positive aspects?
Well, Arturo, you've worked on this a great deal.
Portability of insurance is one of the other game changers that's out there in terms of socioeconomic well-being on both sides of the border. Not only because it would ensure that those 1 million plus Americans that either live permanently in the U.S. or snowbirds spend 6 months in San Miguel or Cabo San Lucas, would not only allow them to, at a fraction of the cost, get their medical services and examinations in Mexico without having to travel back and forth, and again, at a fraction of the cost of what it is in the United States. But it would also open up the door to what I think
for me, is the most challenging but most enticing of the proposal, which is how do we provide for medical insurance to the 11 million Mexicans living in the United States, 5 of which are undocumented. Not only because we provide a safety net, but we defang, we immediately destroy the arguments of those who say that these individuals cross the border because they're seeking to become free riders of education and health services, which is, again, another urban myth. But imagine if we could find ways in which, by working with insurance companies, regulators, and Congress, because this is the big and, we were able to find ways in which both countries can provide portability of insurance across the border. It's a huge, huge game changer for socio-economic well-being. It's going to be tough. The politics of healthcare in this country, I don't have to tell anyone in the city what they look like and what they're probably going to look like in the coming months.
If you think trade is tough, try this.
And an open discussion like this right now, feeding into the immigration debate, that's one of the reasons why, in fact, I shouldn't even be talking about it here. This is one of the reasons why I haven't been talking about it in public.
But this very much represents, I will say, integration 4.0 in U.S.-Mexico. It's about the complementarity of the two health systems in which we could do a lot. Person that I trust, he believes that if the U.S. could offer Medicare in Mexico to Americans, to expats, then perhaps the number of Americans living in Mexico, retiring in Mexico, could be about 4 to 5 million. Just imagine the political weight of those expats living in Mexico, in the U.S. I mean, that will really transform the relationship, and there's a huge opportunity out there. But to do that, we have to overcome the current security and public security crisis, because that's why there's been a lot of expats not coming to the U.S. and a lot of tourism that continue to not come to Mexico because of our current problems. So it's not only about security, but that's an urgent thing that we have to solve very soon.
We've been working on a report with Sidney Weintraub at CSIS on this, and I say it's a great question. I mean, one of the other side effects, if we ever could make this happen, is the spillover effects in the Mexican healthcare system as well, right? I mean, the fact that you could bring in, right now, U.S. expats who have Medicare or have private insurance for the most part, go back to the United States to get their main medical care, right? Or if they need, I actually know someone who had cancer, had to go back to the United States, live with her son to get medical attention for 4 months and then come back, or 6 months or whatever, and came back to Mexico again. So there's no spillover effects in the Mexican healthcare system, but there could be enormous spillover effects that you can devise ways that would actually help Mexicans of all social classes. The big impediment on Medicare is it does need legislation. And I think what you're going to see most likely happening is that private healthcare companies are going to drive this first. Private healthcare companies are going to start covering treatment in Mexico for Americans, and that will be the demonstration effect because it's cheaper, right? For them, it's going to be net savings. It'll be driven by economics. I've got someone who wants to be insured, and it's going to start with Mexican Americans probably. It's going to start with people who they say, we're not afraid to go to Monterrey or to go to Aguascalientes and get healthcare treatment because they speak the language. That'll be the first thing. It'll move from there to retirees, and eventually you'll see sort of a demonstration effect to Medicare. But it's likely to take some time and probably go that direction. But it's a great idea. So I think with this, we've kind of reached the end of this, but look at the recommendations. There are a number of other we didn't talk at all about security today, which is actually fun in a U.S.-Mexico discussion. Not that it's not important. It simply is we know what needs to happen there. That's the one I think we've all worked on the most. We wanted to get some of these other issues out there and really put the accent on some of the possibilities, some of which can happen now and some of which perhaps need to develop a little bit more of the relationship between our two countries. But thank you so much for Jeff Cowan and all his team at Sunnylands and the Ambassador Rafael and, of course, Jane.